February 10th, 1943, 32,000 feet above the frost-hardened fields of occupied France. The air at this altitude burns cold enough to crack exposed skin, thin enough to starve engines not built for such heights. In the cramped cockpit of a Focke-Wulf 190, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler watches the contrails of American bombers streak white across the winter sky like chalk lines drawn by a careless god. He has flown 63 combat missions. He knows the weight of a trigger, the mathematics of deflection shooting, the precise moment when aluminum skin surrenders to cannon fire. Below his wings, the frosted earth stretches silent and occupied. Above, the bomber stream pushes eastward toward Germany's industrial heart, their formations tight, their purpose clear. Stigler adjusts his oxygen mask, feels the familiar weight of his Zeiss gunsight against his brow, and banks his fighter into attack position. He has seen American escorts before, Spitfires borrowed from the British, P-38 Lightnings with their distinctive twin booms. Dangerous aircraft, yes, but range limited, predictable. Today, something different appears on the horizon, something that makes veteran pilots on the radio frequency pause mid-transmission, something that will rewrite the mathematics of air combat over Europe. The shape emerging from the sun glare looks wrong. Too large, too blunt, a massive radial engine cowling that seems to belong on a bomber, not a fighter. Thick wings, a fuselage that appears to have been assembled from surplus parts and American optimism. Through his gunsight, Stigler identifies it, the new American fighter they've been briefed about, the one Luftwaffe intelligence dismisses as a flying milk jug, the P-47 Thunderbolt. In the ready rooms of Luftwaffe bases across France and the Low Countries, pilots have examined the reconnaissance photographs with amusement. 8 tons of fighter aircraft, more than twice the weight of a Messerschmitt 109, powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine that drinks fuel at an astonishing rate. American excess made airborne, they joke. American engineers who never learned that fighters must be light, nimble, graceful. The Thunderbolt appears to be none of these things. It looks like a milk bottle with wings, they say. It looks like a jug. A jug. The nickname spreads through Luftwaffe squadrons like a virus, carried on laughter. But Franz Stigler is not laughing now, because the jug is diving toward him, and its descent carries a quality that his combat experience recognizes immediately: inevitability. The sound reaches him first. Not the high whine of an inline engine, but a deeper thunder, a mechanical roar that seems to compress the air itself. The Thunderbolt falls from altitude like a dropped anvil, accelerating past speeds that should tear wings from airframes, and as it closes the distance, Stigler sees the wing configuration clearly for the first time. 8 gun ports, 4 in each wing, the standard American 50 caliber machine gun, a weapon Luftwaffe pilots respect but do not fear. 8 of them, aimed at him. For precisely 3/4 of a second, Franz Stigler experiences what thousands of German pilots will experience in the months to come: the sudden understanding that everything Luftwaffe intelligence told them about the P-47 Thunderbolt was catastrophically lethally wrong. The opening burst hits his Focke-Wulf with the force of a metal press. Not the sharp punctures of rifle-caliber rounds, but the massive hammer blows of half-inch bullets, traveling at 2,000 feet per second. 8 guns firing in sequence create not a stream of tracers, but a solid column of destruction, a river of lead that turns aircraft aluminum into confetti. Stigler's left aileron disintegrates, his canopy fractures into a spiderweb of cracks. Something vital in his engine bay begins to scream. He rolls inverted, dives, pulls every evasive maneuver his training and instinct can summon. The Thunderbolt follows, not with the graceful roll rate of a 109, but with something more terrifying: absolute, crushing inevitability. It doesn't dance, it pursues. Like a wolf that has learned it doesn't need to be faster than its prey for the entire chase, only at the moment of the kill. Franz Stigler will survive this engagement. He will nurse his damaged fighter back to base, will land with one wheel locked, will climb from his cockpit and stand for a long moment staring at the 47 holes punched through his aircraft's skin. He will file a combat report that his commanding officer will read with skepticism. He will insist, despite the mockery of fellow pilots, that the P-47 Thunderbolt is not a joke, not an American mistake, but possibly the most dangerous fighter aircraft in European skies. He will be one of the first German pilots to understand. He will not be the last. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt begins not in the sky, but in the pragmatic genius of American industrial thinking, in the recognition that war is not won by the most elegant weapon, but by the most effective one, delivered in the greatest numbers, operated by men who can be trained quickly, and who might survive long enough to learn. In the spring of 1940, as German panzers rolled through France and the Luftwaffe established air superiority over continent after continent, American aircraft designers faced a fundamental problem. The war in Europe had demonstrated that modern air combat required fighters capable of altitude, speed, and firepower in combinations that existing designs could not achieve. The graceful pursuits of the 1930s, with their light airframes and rifle-caliber armament, belonged to a vanished age. The new war demanded new solutions. Republic Aviation Corporation, based in Farmingdale, Long Island, approached the problem with characteristic American directness. If European fighters prioritized agility and rate of climb, Republic would build a fighter around one principle: overwhelming power. Not finesse, not tradition, power. The foundation of this philosophy sat in a factory in Hartford, Connecticut, where Pratt & Whitney had developed the R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing over 2,000 horsepower. It was a monster of an engine, designed for bombers and transport aircraft, far too large and heavy for fighter application by conventional thinking. Alexander Kartvelli, Republic's chief designer, looked at the R2800 and saw not a problem but a solution. If the engine was massive, build a massive fighter around it. If the fighter was heavy, use that weight to carry more guns, more ammunition, more armor, more fuel. If critics complained about elegance, point to the smoking wreckage of their elegant fighters scattered across European battlefields. The prototype that emerged from Farmingdale in May 1941 horrified traditionalists. The XP-47B weighed 12,000 pounds empty, nearly twice the weight of a Spitfire, 3 times the weight of a Japanese Zero. Its massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine required elaborate turbocharging systems to maintain power at altitude, systems that added complexity and weight to accommodate the turbocharger's ducting. Designers bulked out the fuselage until it resembled a beer keg with wings. Test pilots climbing into the cockpit for the first time invariably paused, staring at the enormous engine cowling stretching ahead of them, blocking their forward view on the ground, creating blind spots that seemed impossibly dangerous. The control panel bristled with gauges monitoring the complex turbocharging system. The landing gear had to be exceptionally long to keep the massive propeller from striking the ground. Everything about the aircraft seemed wrong by the standards of fighter design inherited from World War I and refined through the 1930s. But when test pilot Lowry Brabham advanced the throttle on that first flight, something remarkable happened. The massive fighter accelerated, and accelerated, and kept accelerating. At 25,000 feet, where thin air strangled conventional engines, the P-47's turbocharger came into its element, cramming dense air into the cylinders, maintaining power that made European fighters gasp and fade. Brabham pushed the Thunderbolt into a dive, and watched the airspeed indicator climb past 400 miles per hour, past 450, into realms where control surfaces should flutter and wings should fold. The massive airframe, built with American structural steel and over-engineering, simply absorbed the stress. The P-47 didn't just dive, it fell like a projectile, accelerating to speeds that turned it into a missile with a pilot inside. The armament sealed the design philosophy: 8 Browning main 2.50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, each gun capable of firing 800 rounds per minute, each bullet weighing nearly 2 ounces, traveling at 2,800 feet per second, carrying muzzle energy that could punch through armor plate, sever structural members, detonate fuel tanks. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, they delivered over 300 rounds per second into the target area. The convergence pattern, carefully calibrated so all 8 streams of fire met at a point 300 yards ahead of the aircraft, created a cone of destruction measuring 6 feet in diameter. Anything caught in that cone for more than a fraction of a second ceased to exist as a functional aircraft and became instead a cloud of debris held together temporarily by momentum and hope. European pilots, viewing reconnaissance photographs and intelligence reports in late 1942, dismissed the P-47 with the casual certainty of veterans who knew what fighters should look like. Too heavy, too large, too much engine, too much gun, too much American enthusiasm insufficient tempered by aerodynamic reality. The Focke-Wulf 190 by comparison seemed a masterpiece of engineering efficiency. 7 tons versus 8, compact radial engine versus massive turbocharged behemoth. Excellent roll rate, good climb performance, battle-proven. Luftwaffe pilots examined the specifications of the incoming American fighter and felt, if anything, relief. Let the Americans bring their flying milk jugs. Let them learn, as so many had learned before, that air combat rewarded skill and agility, not brute force. This confidence extended through the entire chain of German command. Intelligence estimates suggested the P-47 would be relegated to homeland defense duties, too short range to escort bombers deep into Europe, too clumsy to engage Luftwaffe fighters on equal terms. If American bombers were to be stopped, and German air superiority maintained, the Thunderbolt represented at worst a minor complication, at best a gift: heavy American fighters that could be engaged and destroyed by lighter, more maneuverable German aircraft flown by pilots with years of combat experience. The strategic calculus seemed clear, the mathematics seemed settled, the outcome seemed predetermined. The first P-47 Thunderbolts arrived in England in late 1942, assigned to the 56th Fighter Group and the 78th Fighter Group, based at Horsham St. Faith and Duxford. American pilots climbing into the cockpit for the first time experienced the same disorientation as test pilots back in the States. The sheer size of the aircraft, the complexity of the turbocharger controls, the weight of the control stick at low speeds, all created an impression of flying a medium bomber rather than a fighter. On the ground, the Thunderbolt seemed ponderous, almost comical. Pilots taxiing for takeoff had to S-turn down the runway to see past the massive engine cowling. Takeoff required careful attention to torque as that enormous propeller bit the air. Early training flights produced a steady stream of incidents: ground loops, hard landings, overstressed airframes as pilots accustomed to lighter fighters misjudged the P-47's momentum. But at altitude, the transformation occurred. At 25,000 feet, where Spitfires and P-38s began to labor, the Thunderbolt came alive. The turbocharger, that complex system of ducts and intercoolers that added so much weight and complexity, delivered its promise. The R-2800 engine, gulping dense air force fed by the turbocharger, produced full power in the thin stratosphere. Pilots who struggled with the P-47's ponderous ground handling discovered that above 20,000 feet, the massive fighter could outclimb German interceptors. Above 30,000 feet, it owned the sky. The P-47 might not turn with a Focke-Wulf or roll with a Messerschmitt, but it could dive faster than anything in European skies, zoom climb back to altitude, while enemy fighters stalled and fell away, and use its tremendous speed advantage to dictate the terms of combat. The learning curve, however, was written in blood. Early missions in the spring of 1943 saw American pilots attempting to dogfight German fighters using the tactics they'd learned on lighter aircraft. They tried to turn with Focke-Wulfs, to climb from ground level with Messerschmitts, to engage in the swirling knife fights that characterized European air combat. The results were predictable. P-47s, flown by pilots who didn't yet understand their aircraft's strengths, fell to German fighters, flown by veterans who knew exactly how to exploit the American fighter's apparent weaknesses. Loss rates climbed. Confidence wavered. In the bars and ready rooms of 8th Air Force fighter bases, pilots began to wonder if the Thunderbolt would ever be more than a useful escort, a defensive weapon capable of protecting bombers, but incapable of achieving air superiority against Germany's finest. The transformation began with commanders who understood energy tactics, who recognized that the P-47's weight and power could be converted into an entirely different form of air combat. Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, studied the loss reports and recognized the pattern. Every P-47 shot down had been caught slow, caught low, caught trying to turn with lighter fighters. The solution was to fly high, dive fast, hit hard, and climb away before the enemy could react. Use altitude as a bank account, trading height for speed, speed for killing position, then use the Thunderbolt's superior climb rate to regain altitude, while German fighters struggled to follow. Never dogfight, never turn, never try to be graceful, be inevitable instead. The tactics spread through word of mouth and bitter experience. Maintain altitude advantage. Watch for enemy formations below. Roll inverted and dive, letting gravity and that massive engine accelerate the Thunderbolt past 500 miles per hour. Close to firing range while the target is still a dot in the gun sight. Fire one burst from the 8.50 calibers. Don't wait to observe results. Extend in the dive. Use the accumulated speed to zoom climb back to altitude. Arrive above the fight with energy to spare. If enemy fighters follow, they arrive slow and vulnerable. If they don't follow, they cede altitude control and accept that the sky above them belongs to American fighters who can dive on them at will. German pilots, encountering these tactics for the first time, experienced a form of combat fundamentally different from everything they'd learned. The P-47 didn't dogfight. It didn't offer vulnerable moments during turns when a skilled pilot could slide onto its tail. It appeared from above, moving at speeds that made evasion nearly impossible, fired a burst of such devastating weight that even a glancing hit could cripple an aircraft, then climbed away before German fighters could react. Trying to follow the Thunderbolt in its climb was suicide. The American fighter simply accelerated upward while pursuing Messerschmitts, lost airspeed, and became easy targets for other P-47s still at altitude. Trying to disengage was equally futile. The Thunderbolt's dive speed meant it could chase down any fighter attempting to flee. The psychological impact went beyond tactics. Luftwaffe pilots had grown accustomed to a certain rhythm of air combat, an almost chivalrous exchange where skill and aircraft performance created a comprehensible equation. The best pilot in the best position usually won. Mistakes were punished, but skill was rewarded. The Thunderbolt disrupted this equation entirely. A Luftwaffe ace with 50 kills could execute a perfect defensive maneuver, could do everything his training and experience dictated, and still die because 50 caliber bullets found his engine or cockpit during a half-second burst from a P-47 he never saw coming. The randomness was terrifying. The randomness was terrifying. The inevitability was worse. By the summer of 1943, the kill ratios began to shift. P-47 groups that had struggled to break even in their early missions now reported 4-to-1, 5-to-1 exchange rates. The Thunderbolt's ruggedness became legendary. Pilots returned to base with damage that would have destroyed lighter fighters. Engine cylinders shot out, control surfaces shredded, fuselages punctured by cannon shells. The massive radial engine could absorb 20 cannon hits and continue running. The heavy airframe could take structural damage that would have broken a Spitfire or P-51 in half. Multiple pilots reported being hit by German fighters, seeing pieces of their aircraft depart in flight, and still flying home. The P-47 didn't just fight, it survived. The symbolic weight of this survival cannot be overstated. German pilots, struggling with fuel shortages and replacement aircraft built by slave labor with declining quality control, flew fighters that were maintained by overworked ground crews using whatever parts could be scavenged. American pilots flew aircraft that arrived from the factory with such build quality and over-engineering that they could absorb battle damage. British fighters couldn't survive. The contrast was not subtle. Every P-47 that returned to base missing chunks of wing, trailing oil from a perforated engine, riddled with holes but still flying, represented American industrial capacity made visible. The Thunderbolt became proof that America could afford to overbuild, to add redundant systems, to use strategic materials in quantities that seemed wasteful, because American industry produced them in such abundance that waste became a viable strategy. March 4, 1944. The sky over Berlin. For the first time in the war, American heavy bombers strike the German capital in daylight, and for the first time, P-47 Thunderbolts fly escort over the city itself. The mission represents a turning point so profound that its implications will not be fully understood until years later. Berlin, the symbolic and administrative heart of the Third Reich, has been beyond the range of American escort fighters. Luftwaffe defenders have enjoyed sanctuary, able to attack bomber formations without fear of encountering American fighters with sufficient fuel to engage in prolonged combat. The arrival of P-47 sat over Berlin shatters this sanctuary. The symbolic and practical implications ripple through the German command structure like a shock wave. Oberstleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, a veteran fighter pilot with over 100 kills, watches from his Messerschmitt 109 as American fighters orbit above the bomber stream at 32,000 feet. He has fought P-47s before, has learned their tactics, has survived encounters that killed less experienced pilots. But seeing them here, over Berlin, fundamentally changes the mathematics of the air war. If American fighters can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere in Germany. If they can maintain combat effectiveness over the capital, there is no sanctuary left, no refuge where Luftwaffe fighters can operate without encountering American escorts. The strategic implications compress into a single brutal realization. Germany has lost air superiority over its own territory. The combat that follows is brief, violent, and one-sided. Steinhoff's formation attempts to intercept the bombers from above, diving through the escort screen hoping to damage enough bombers to disrupt the formation before American fighters can react. The P-47 size react immediately. 4 Thunderbolts roll inverted and dive, accelerating past 500 miles per hour, and the closing speed is so extreme that Steinhoff barely has time to register their presence before the first burst hits his wingman. The Messerschmitt's tail section simply disintegrates, transformed from functional aircraft component into a cloud of aluminum fragments by the weight of fire from 8.50 calibers. The pilot doesn't bail out. He dies in his cockpit, still strapped to what remains of his fighter, falling 4 miles to impact in a Berlin suburb. Steinhoff pulls hard, feels the G-forces compress his vision into a tunnel, executes a perfect reversal that should position him behind the attacking P-47. But the Thunderbolt doesn't continue its dive. It bottoms out below the bomber stream, then pulls up in a climb so steep and so fast that Steinhoff's 109, already near its performance envelope, cannot follow. The American fighter claws back to altitude, arrives above the bomber stream again, and resumes its orbital patrol as if the attack cost it nothing. Steinhoff watches this with the sick understanding of a professional who recognizes superior equipment and superior tactics when he encounters them. The P-47 didn't outfly his Messerschmitt. It didn't need to. It simply operated in a flight regime where the 109 couldn't match its performance, executed tactics that made German counter-tactics irrelevant, and survived through a combination of speed, altitude, and structural strength that turned air combat from skill-based engagement into systematic slaughter. The American pilots flying these missions over Berlin are, by Luftwaffe standards, inexperienced. Many have fewer than 100 flight hours in type. Their gunnery, compared to Luftwaffe aces with years of combat, is adequate at best, but they fly aircraft that compensate for inexperience with overwhelming advantages in speed, altitude performance, firepower, and durability. A mediocre American pilot in a P-47 can kill an excellent German pilot in a 109 simply by following doctrine, maintaining altitude, and firing when the tactical situation favors engagement. The equation has shifted from individual skill to systemic advantage. This shift represents perhaps the most profound transformation in the air war, the point at which American industrial capacity and tactical doctrine overcome German pilot quality and aircraft elegance. The kill ratios by mid-1944 tell the story in numbers that Luftwaffe commanders cannot dispute. P-47 groups are achieving 6-to-1, 7-to-1 exchange rates. Some missions report 10 German fighters destroyed for every Thunderbolt lost. These numbers represent not just tactical success but strategic dominance. Germany cannot replace pilots and aircraft at these ratios. The Luftwaffe's carefully husbanded veteran pilots, the men with 50, 70, 100 kills, are dying over their own territory in combats where their skill and experience provide no survival advantage. The symbolic and practical implications are identical. Germany is losing the air war not through lack of courage or skill but through simple mathematics. American industry can produce Thunderbolts faster than Germany can produce pilots to die fighting them. The object that comes to symbolize this imbalance is not the P-47 itself, but the .50 caliber ammunition it fires. Each Thunderbolt carries 3,400 rounds, over 420 pounds of ammunition distributed across 8 guns. This represents more ammunition than many Luftwaffe fighters carried fuel. The logistical chain required to deliver this ammunition to forward bases in England, to load it into aircraft, to expend it over Germany in return for more, represents industrial capacity of a scale that German planners cannot match. American factories produce 50 caliber ammunition in such quantities that pilots are instructed to test fire their guns before entering combat, to expend ammunition confirming weapons functionality, a practice that would be unthinkable in Luftwaffe units struggling with ammunition shortages. Captured German pilots, interrogated after being shot down by P-47s, consistently report the same psychological impact. The weight of fire is unlike anything they've experienced. One burst from 8.50 calibers delivers more kinetic energy than 30 seconds of fire from dual rifle caliber guns. The effect on aircraft structure is catastrophic. Control surfaces separate, fuel tanks explode, structural members fail, engines seize. German fighters built light to maximize maneuverability simply cannot absorb this punishment. They come apart like balsa wood models struck by hammers. The psychological impact of seeing wingmen disintegrate, of watching fighters more maneuverable and often better flown than their American opponents, simply cease to exist when caught by a P-47's guns, creates a fatalism that no amount of propaganda can overcome. By late 1944, Luftwaffe tactical doctrine has evolved to avoid P-47s whenever possible. Intelligence officers brief pilots to engage American bombers only when Thunderbolt escorts are absent or distracted. If P-47s are present in strength at altitude, disengage, do not pursue, do not attempt to climb after them, survive and engage another day when conditions are more favorable. This represents complete strategic defeat. When an air force instructs its pilots to avoid combat with enemy fighters, it concedes air superiority. The skies over Germany belong to whoever controls the altitude above 30,000 feet, and at those altitudes the P-47 Thunderbolt is effectively untouchable by anything the Luftwaffe can deploy in operationally significant numbers. The irony is not lost on surviving German pilots. The fighter they mocked as a flying milk jug, too heavy to dogfight, too clumsy to engage properly, has become the weapon they fear most. Not the graceful Spitfire, not the long-ranged Mustang that will eventually replace the P-47 in many escort roles, but the brutal, inelegant Thunderbolt with its massive engine and 8 machine guns. The P-47 doesn't pretend to be graceful. It doesn't aspire to the aesthetic ideals that shaped European fighter design. It is American pragmatism made lethal, overwhelming power, applied with systematic efficiency, in quantities sufficient to make individual skill increasingly irrelevant. The ground attack role that the P-47 assumes in late 1944 and 1945 amplifies its symbolic impact beyond air combat. As Allied armies advance across France and into Germany, Thunderbolts transition from pure fighter duties to fighter-bomber operations, carrying bombs and rockets in addition to their 8 machine guns. The sight of P-47s at low altitude, strafing German columns, becomes one of the defining terrors of the war's final year. German soldiers learn to recognize the sound of the R-2800 engine, learn to dive for cover at the first sign of a Thunderbolt's approach, learn that roads and railways offer no protection against an aircraft that can deliver 2,000 pounds of ordnance with its bombs and rockets, then make repeated strafing passes with guns that turn trucks into scrap metal and locomotives into stationary coffins. The effectiveness of the P-47 in ground attack stems from the same characteristics that make it effective in air combat. The rugged airframe can absorb ground fire that would destroy lighter fighters. The air-cooled radial engine can take small arms hits and continue functioning. The 850 caliber guns, effective against aircraft, are devastating against ground targets. A single strafing pass can destroy multiple vehicles, kill dozens of soldiers, create traffic jams that take hours to clear. Multiple P-47s working over a German column can achieve effects previously requiring medium bombers, and they can do it with accuracy bombers cannot match. The psychological effect on German ground forces mirrors the impact on Luftwaffe pilots. There is no effective defense. Anti-aircraft fire sometimes brings down Thunderbolts, but the aircraft's durability means many pilots survive hits that would kill others, and the survivors return the next day with fresh aircraft and unlimited ammunition. The randomness is terrifying. A soldier can be advancing down a road, can be doing everything correctly, and die because a P-47 pilot spotted his column from 5 miles away and decided to investigate. The sense of helplessness, of being hunted by an enemy with total air superiority, and the industrial capacity to maintain that superiority indefinitely, corrodes morale in ways that ground combat cannot. German civilians experience this terror firsthand as P-47s range across Germany in the war's final months, attacking anything that moves. Trains become particular targets. The Thunderbolt's speed allows it to appear suddenly, attack before anti-aircraft defenses can respond, and disappear before counterfire becomes effective. Entire railway networks become unusable during daylight hours. Supply chains that sustained the German war effort fragment under constant interdiction. The strategic impact compounds locomotives destroyed cannot be quickly replaced. Railway cars left burning beside tracks cannot deliver supplies. Junctions cratered by bombs cannot route traffic. The cumulative effect of thousands of P-47 sorties is to strangle German logistics, to make movement by day suicidal, to force a modern industrial army back to the tactics of previous centuries, where operations happened at night and daylight meant hiding. The symbolic object that represents this transformation is not elegant or complex. It is the .50 caliber API cartridge, armor-piercing incendiary, the standard loading for P-47 guns in ground attack. When this bullet strikes a fuel tank, the incendiary compound ignites spilled gasoline. When it strikes an ammunition truck, the result is spectacular. When it strikes a locomotive boiler, superheated steam adds to the destruction. The .50 API round represents American military-industrial thinking at its most pragmatic. A bullet designed not to wound but to destroy, loaded into guns that can fire hundreds per minute, carried by aircraft produced in thousands, flown by pilots who can be replaced, against an enemy whose industrial capacity cannot match American production, and whose ideology cannot sustain the casualty rates that American firepower creates. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe has effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Surviving fighters hide on dispersed airfields, flying only when fuel is available and conditions absolutely require it. The skies belong to American fighters, and among those fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt remains ubiquitous. More than 15,000 have been built by war's end, equipping over 40 fighter groups, serving in every theater, flown by pilots who learned their trade not in years of peacetime flying but in months of intensive training that American industrial capacity made possible. These pilots are not, by pre-war standards, particularly skilled. Many have fewer than 300 hours total flight time when they enter combat, but they fly aircraft that make skill less critical than doctrine, and the doctrine is simple: maintain altitude, dive fast, shoot straight, climb away, follow this and survive, deviate and die. The final missions flown by P-47s over Germany in April and May 1945 encounter little resistance. German fighters that do appear are flown by pilots with minimal training and aircraft produced by an industry collapsing under the weight of strategic bombing and resource depletion. The combats are brief and one-sided. The symbolic impact of these final missions lies not in their tactical significance, but in what they represent: complete air superiority achieved and maintained through industrial capacity, tactical doctrine and weapons systems that prioritized effectiveness over elegance. The P-47 Thunderbolt, mocked in 1943 as too heavy to fight, ends the war as one of the most effective fighter aircraft of the conflict, with a kill ratio that validates every design decision Republic's engineers made. The contrast between expectation and reality defines the Thunderbolt's legacy. German pilots expected to face an aircraft that would attempt to fight on German terms using German tactics, constrained by European assumptions about what fighters should be. They encountered instead an aircraft that rejected those assumptions entirely, that built success not on grace but on power, not on agility but on altitude, not on tradition but on systematic application of overwhelming force. The Thunderbolt represented a fundamentally American approach to warfare: identify the problem, allocate resources without regard to traditional constraints, engineer a solution that prioritizes effectiveness over elegance, produce it in quantities sufficient to make numerical superiority inevitable, and employ it with tactics that maximize its strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. The learning curve for German pilots who survived encounters with P-47s followed a consistent pattern. Initial dismissal gave way to respect. Respect gave way to fear. Fear gave way to avoidance. By 1945, Luftwaffe tactical doctrine explicitly advised against engaging P-47s unless circumstances offered overwhelming advantage. This represents complete psychological defeat. When veteran pilots with hundreds of combat hours prefer to avoid combat with enemy fighters, when tactical planning prioritizes not victory, but survival, when the mere presence of an enemy aircraft type causes formations to break off attacks, the war is effectively lost. The letters home from American P-47 pilots in 1944 and 1945 reveal a pride that goes beyond individual achievement. These men, many of them civilians a year earlier, fly aircraft that represent American industrial might made tangible. They fire guns that never run out of ammunition. They fly on fuel delivered by supply chains that never fail. They operate from bases built by American engineering battalions. They eat food shipped from American farms. They wear flight suits manufactured in American factories. The entire logistical apparatus supporting their missions represents a level of organizational capacity that their enemies cannot match. This knowledge pervades their letters. They understand they are not winning through superior skill or courage, but through superior resources systematically applied. One recurring theme in these letters is the aircraft's durability. Pilots describe returning from missions with battle damage that should have been fatal, describe watching the massive radial engine continue running despite holes punched through cylinders, describe control surfaces shot half away that still function well enough to reach base. This durability creates confidence that lighter fighters cannot match. British pilots flying Spitfires know that a single 20 cannon shell in the engine means bailout or crash landing. P-47 pilots know their aircraft can absorb multiple hits and keep flying. This knowledge changes how pilots fight. It enables aggression. It rewards pressing attacks home. It means the difference between breaking off early and staying on target long enough to kill. The Luftwaffe has no equivalent to this confidence. German pilots fly fighters maintained by ground crews who lack parts, fueled by supplies that are increasingly adulterated with substitutes, armed with ammunition produced by slave labor with declining quality control. They know that engine failure means death, because there is no rescue behind enemy lines. That battle damage means their aircraft may not be replaced, that every mission might be their last, not because of enemy action, but because the logistical system supporting them is collapsing. The psychological impact of this knowledge is corrosive. It makes pilots conservative, cautious, unwilling to take risks that might achieve tactical success but guarantee strategic loss. The symbolic contrast becomes most apparent in the treatment of damaged aircraft. When a P-47 returns to base with battle damage, ground crews swarm over it, replacing components from well-stocked supply depots, returning it to service within days or hours. If damage is too severe, the aircraft is written off and replaced with a fresh Thunderbolt from the steady stream arriving from American factories. There is no shortage. There is no crisis. The system has such redundancy that individual aircraft become almost disposable. German ground crews, working with captured aircraft and ersatz parts, watching their fighter strength decline not from combat losses, but from simple mechanical failure, observe this abundance with a mixture of envy and despair. The .50 caliber machine gun, that recurring symbol of American firepower, embodies this abundance. Each round costs approximately 15 cents to manufacture. Each P-47 carries 3,400 rounds. A full ammunition load represents roughly $500 in 1944 currency, spent on disposable ammunition that will be expended in seconds of combat. The casual expenditure of this much ordnance would be unthinkable in Luftwaffe units struggling with ammunition rationing. American pilots test-fire their guns before combat, expend hundreds of rounds confirming functionality, and rearm from supplies that seem limitless. The psychological impact on enemies who witness this expenditure cannot be quantified, but it appears consistently in captured documents and prisoner interrogations. The Americans, German reports note, fight as if their supply of ammunition is infinite. This is not metaphor. From the perspective of frontline units, American ammunition supplies effectively are infinite. By late 1944, the strategic situation has deteriorated to the point where Luftwaffe fighter units can no longer achieve their primary mission, defending German territory from Allied bombing. The skies fill with American aircraft, and among those aircraft, the P-47 Thunderbolt represents perhaps the most visible symbol of American dominance. It is not the fastest American fighter, not the most maneuverable, not the longest ranged, but it is ubiquitous. Thunderbolts appear over every target, at every altitude, in numbers that make tactical victories irrelevant. Shooting down 5 P-47s means nothing when 50 more arrive the next day. The mathematics are brutal and inescapable. Germany cannot win an attrition war against an enemy whose industrial capacity outproduces German factories by ratios of 10 to 1, 20 to 1. The transformation of the Thunderbolt from mocked newcomer to feared opponent parallels a larger transformation in how the war is fought and won. In 1940, Germany achieved victory through superior tactics, better training, more effective doctrine. Individual German units routinely defeated larger Allied forces through skill and coordination. By 1945, skill and coordination matter less than industrial output and logistical capacity. A mediocre American unit with good equipment and unlimited supplies can defeat an excellent German unit with worn equipment and failing logistics. The P-47 Thunderbolt represents this transformation made tangible. It is not a brilliant aircraft, it is an effective one, produced in quantity, employed with systematic efficiency, maintained by a logistical apparatus that never fails. The final irony is that German intelligence was correct about the P-47's characteristics. It was too heavy to dogfight effectively. It did consume fuel at an alarming rate. It was built like a flying tank, rather than a graceful fighter. Every criticism Luftwaffe analysts made about the Thunderbolt was factually accurate. What they failed to understand was that these characteristics, in the context of American tactical doctrine and industrial capacity, became advantages rather than flaws. The P-47 didn't need to dogfight because it could dictate engagement terms through superior altitude and speed. It didn't need to conserve fuel because American logistics could deliver unlimited fuel to forward bases. It didn't need to be graceful because durability and firepower mattered more than elegance in the systematic slaughter that air combat had become. April 26, 1945. A P-47 Thunderbolt of the 56th Fighter Group makes the last combat mission of the European war for its unit, a sweep over Bavaria looking for targets of opportunity. The pilot, a 22-year-old second lieutenant with 40 combat hours, finds a German truck convoy stopped on a road, soldiers dispersing into the woods at the sound of his approach. He rolls into a strafing run, fires a 2-second burst from his .50 calibers, watches the lead truck explode, and the convoy scatter. He pulls up, climbs back to altitude, and returns to base. The mission lasts 90 minutes. He will file a routine combat report noting 1 truck destroyed, possible casualties, no enemy opposition encountered. It is in every measurable way an unremarkable mission. But the symbolism of this routine mission contains the entire story of the P-47 Thunderbolt and what it represented. An inexperienced pilot, flying an aircraft that German intelligence dismissed 3 years earlier, achieves tactical success through systematic application of overwhelming firepower. He faces no meaningful opposition, because the Luftwaffe no longer exists as an effective force. Ground down through attrition, it could not sustain against an enemy whose industrial capacity made losses irreplaceable. He operates with complete confidence in his aircraft's ability to absorb damage and return him safely, confidence that German pilots have not felt in years. He expends ammunition without counting rounds because American logistics will rearm him immediately upon return. He flies because American industry has produced so many Thunderbolts that they are available for every mission, every day until the enemy surrenders. The contrast with a German pilot's experience on the same day is absolute. If German fighters fly at all, they fly with minimal fuel, instructions to avoid combat, unless victory is certain, knowledge that damage means their aircraft likely will not be replaced. They operate without confidence in their equipment, their supplies, or their survival. They have watched their air force transform from the world's finest to a remnant force flying obsolescent aircraft against enemies who own the sky. The psychological distance between these two experiences measures the gulf between American and German capacity in 1945, and the P-47 Thunderbolt represents that gulf more clearly than any strategic analysis could articulate. The war in Europe ends 2 weeks after this routine mission. P-47 Thunderbolts sit on airfields across Germany, France, and England, ready for missions that will never fly. The statistics are recorded. 15,686 P-47CA built, more than any other American fighter except the P-51 Mustang. Over 3,700 air-to-air victories credited to Thunderbolt pilots. Thousands of ground targets destroyed. Loss rate significantly lower than contemporary fighters. These numbers validate every engineering decision, every strategic choice, every tactical doctrine developed around the aircraft. The P-47 succeeded not because it was the best fighter of the war, a title that inspires endless debate, but because it was effective, producible, and employed with systematic efficiency. The Thunderbolt's legacy extends beyond statistics into the realm of symbolic representation. It embodied American military philosophy. When faced with a problem, apply overwhelming force. When constrained by traditional thinking, reject tradition and engineer new solutions. When critics mock your approach, prove them wrong through results rather than argument. The P-47 was mocked as a flying milk jug, too heavy to fight, too clumsy to survive. It ended the war with the second highest production total of American fighters, and a combat record that vindicated every design choice. The journey from mockery to respect to fear took less than 2 years and cost thousands of German pilots their lives. For the German pilots who survived the war, who endured the transformation of the Luftwaffe from elite force to defeated remnant, the P-47 Thunderbolt occupies a unique place in memory. It was not the aircraft that broke them. No single weapons system could claim that distinction, but it represented the systematic application of American industrial might that made their defeat inevitable. Every P-47 they encountered carried the implicit message: you cannot win this war. You cannot match our production. You cannot sustain our losses. You cannot compete with our abundance. Fight us and die, or surrender and survive. There is no third option. The 8.50 caliber machine guns, that recurring symbol throughout the Thunderbolt's combat history, delivered this message with brutal clarity. When those guns fired, they represented not just individual firepower but the entire American military-industrial complex compressed into a 3-second burst. Each bullet was manufactured in American factories, shipped across the Atlantic, loaded by American ground crews, fired by American pilots, flying American aircraft maintained by American logistics. The system behind the bullet mattered more than the bullet itself. The P-47 was deadly, not because it was elegant, but because it was the visible edge of a logistical apparatus so vast and efficient that it could sustain operations that would bankrupt lesser nations. In the decades after the war, veterans from both sides would meet at reunions and conferences, would share their experiences, would discuss the aircraft they flew and fought against. German pilots consistently expressed a particular respect for the P-47, a respect born not of aesthetic appreciation but of professional acknowledgement. They respected the Thunderbolt because it represented honest engineering applied to violent purpose. It made no claims to grace. It was a machine built to kill, built to survive, built to be produced in numbers that made individual losses irrelevant. In this honesty there was a kind of terrible purity that pilots who had flown beautiful, fragile fighters could appreciate even as they mourned the men those thunderbolts had killed. The symbolic transformation is complete, from joke to legend, from milk jug to war winner, from mock to newcomer to respected opponent. The P-47 Thunderbolt forced a fundamental reevaluation of what fighters should be and how air combat should be fought. It proved that altitude and energy could overcome agility, that systematic tactics could overcome individual skill, that industrial capacity could overcome tactical brilliance. These lessons would shape air combat doctrine for decades, would influence fighter design into the jet age, would establish principles that remain valid into the 21st century. The epilogue to the Thunderbolt's story is written in the skies. It came to dominate, in the pilots it saved, in the enemies it destroyed, in the strategic outcomes it enabled. The massive fighter that German intelligence dismissed in 1943 helped establish air superiority that made Allied victory inevitable. It protected bombers that destroyed German industry. It strafed columns that could not reach the battlefield. It shot down fighters that could not be replaced. It did all this not through elegance or grace, but through systematic application of overwhelming force, the most American of military philosophies made manifest in aluminum and steel. For the young men who flew P-47s, the aircraft represented something beyond tactical capability. It represented the promise that American industry would protect them, that American abundance would sustain them, that American engineering would bring them home. The Thunderbolt's durability saved hundreds of pilots who would have died in lighter fighters. Its firepower gave them the tools to win engagements that skill alone could not. Its altitude performance let them dictate combat terms rather than accept enemy conditions. These advantages were not subtle. They were overwhelming. They transformed inexperienced pilots into effective combat aviators through the simple expedient of giving them such superior equipment that tactical mistakes became survivable and strategic advantages became decisive. The final judgment on the P-47 Thunderbolt belongs to the men who faced it in combat, who learned to fear the sound of its engine, who watched comrades die under its guns, who tried every tactical innovation they could devise to counter its advantages, and failed. Their judgment is consistent. The Thunderbolt was not the best fighter of the war, but it was among the most effective, and in war, effectiveness matters more than perfection. It achieved its strategic purpose through a combination of design, doctrine, and industrial capacity that enemies could neither match nor counter. It forced Luftwaffe fighters from the sky and kept them there until Germany surrendered. In this achievement lies a larger truth about war and industry and national character. The P-47 Thunderbolt succeeded because it represented what America could do that its enemies could not: produce excellent equipment in overwhelming numbers, develop tactics that maximized equipment advantages, sustain operations through logistics that never failed, replace losses faster than enemies could inflict them. These capabilities did not arise from superior courage or innate virtue. They arose from industrial capacity, organizational efficiency, and a pragmatic willingness to reject tradition when tradition proved ineffective. The transformation from mocked to feared took less than 2 years. The journey from derision to respect was measured in combat reports, kill ratios, and the steadily declining number of Luftwaffe fighters willing to engage American escorts. By 1945, the transformation was complete. The flying milk jug had become the jug, spoken with the same respect German soldiers used for Sherman tanks and American artillery, grudging acknowledgement of effectiveness that could not be denied. The sky above Europe in May 1945 belongs to aircraft painted with American stars, and among those aircraft, the P-47 Thunderbolt remains ubiquitous. It did not win the war alone. No single weapon system could claim that honor, but it contributed to victory in ways that validated every engineering choice, every tactical decision, every strategic calculation that brought it from drawing board to combat. The massive fighter that seemed wrong by every traditional standard proved right by the only standard that mattered. It worked. The laughter of German pilots who first saw the P-47 echoes across the years, hollow and bitter, the sound of men who underestimated their enemy and paid for that mistake with their lives and their war. They laughed at the milk jug. They mocked its weight, its size, its apparent clumsiness. Then they met it in combat, felt the weight of 8.50 caliber guns, watched it dive away at speeds they could not match, saw it climb back to altitude while their fighters stalled and fell. The laughter stopped, the fear began, and in that transformation, in that journey from mockery to terror, lies the entire story of how industrial capacity and tactical innovation can overcome tradition and skill, how abundance can defeat experience, how American pragmatism can triumph over European elegance. The P-47 Thunderbolt, too heavy to fight, too clumsy to win, too American to fail. Epilogue: The Weight of Thunder. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is not merely a chronicle of aircraft specifications and combat statistics. It is a meditation on the nature of industrial warfare, on the moment when the romantic notions of aerial combat surrendered to the brutal mathematics of production capacity and systematic violence. In the span of 30 months, from the first uncertain missions over occupied France to the final sweeps over a defeated Germany, the Thunderbolt transformed not just tactical outcomes but the very philosophy of how wars are fought and won. What the Luftwaffe pilots failed to understand in their initial mockery was that they were not simply facing a new fighter aircraft. They were confronting an entirely different conception of warfare itself. The P-47 represented the industrialization of air combat, the moment when individual skill became subordinate to systemic advantage, when the craftsmanship of flying gave way to the science of logistics. Every Thunderbolt that appeared over Europe carried with it the implicit promise of 10 more behind it, 100 more in production, 1,000 more planned. This was not a weapon. This was a statement of industrial intent. We can build these faster than you can shoot them down, and we will continue building them until you surrender or die. The 8.50 caliber machine guns, that recurring symbol throughout the Thunderbolt's operational life, embodied more than firepower. They embodied American abundance, made lethal. Each gun represented thousands of rounds of ammunition. Each round represented cents of American industrial output, and the casual expenditure of this ammunition in test firing and combat represented wealth that Germany simply could not match. When a P-47 pilot fired a 3-second burst, he expended more monetary value in ammunition than many German soldiers earned in a month. This profligacy was not waste. It was strategy. It was the deliberate application of overwhelming resources to achieve outcomes that skill alone could never guarantee. The transformation German pilots experienced, from laughter to respect to fear to avoidance, mirrors a larger transformation in how the Second World War was decided. In 1940, Germany won through superior tactics and better trained forces. By 1945, tactics and training mattered less than production capacity and logistical endurance. The P-47 Thunderbolt stands as perhaps the clearest symbol of this transformation. It was not particularly graceful. It was not the fastest or most maneuverable fighter of the war. It was simply effective, producible, and employed with systematic efficiency by a nation whose industrial capacity could sustain losses that would have bankrupted its enemies. The durability of the Thunderbolt saved hundreds of American lives, and in saving those lives, it demonstrated a fundamental difference in how America and Germany valued their pilots. German aces with 100 kills were irreplaceable assets, men whose loss represented years of training and experience that could never be recovered. American pilots were, in a sense, replaceable components in a larger system, not because individual lives mattered less, but because the system was designed to absorb losses and continue functioning. A P-47 pilot shot down over Germany could be replaced within days by another pilot arriving from training schools that graduated thousands annually. The aircraft he flew could be replaced within hours from stocks that seemed inexhaustible. This systemic resilience, this ability to absorb casualties that would cripple less industrialized nations, ultimately proved more decisive than any tactical innovation. The final months of the war, when P-47 set ranged across Germany attacking anything that moved, represented the culmination of air superiority achieved through industrial dominance. German soldiers, hiding in forests at the sound of a Thunderbolt's engine, German locomotives abandoned on sidings because moving by day meant death, German commanders planning operations around the assumption of complete Allied air superiority, all testified to a defeat so total that it transcended military categories and became existential. The sky itself had become enemy territory, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was the instrument of that transformation. For the American pilots who flew these missions, the experience represented something unique in military history: the ability to fight a modern war with confidence in their equipment, their logistics, and their survival. They flew knowing that if shot down, rescue operations would search for them. They flew knowing that damage to their aircraft would not strand them in hostile territory. They flew knowing that tomorrow would bring fresh aircraft, full ammunition, and missions flown with the same systematic efficiency as today's. This confidence, born of industrial abundance and organizational competence, created a psychological advantage that no amount of tactical skill on the German side could overcome. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt extends far beyond its combat record. It established principles that would govern fighter design and air combat doctrine for generations. Energy tactics, the use of altitude and speed to overcome maneuverability disadvantages, became standard doctrine. Heavy armament became expected rather than exceptional. Durability and pilot protection became design priorities rather than afterthoughts. These lessons were learned in blood over the skies of Europe, written in the wreckage of German fighters that could not match the Thunderbolt's systematic advantages. But perhaps the deepest legacy is symbolic, rather than technical. The P-47 Thunderbolt proved that wars are won, not by the most elegant weapon but by the most effective one, deployed in sufficient numbers, sustained by logistics that never fail. It proved that industrial capacity can overcome tactical brilliance, that systematic application of adequate force defeats sporadic application of superior skill. These are uncomfortable truths for those who prefer to imagine war as a test of courage and ability, rather than a contest of production statistics and supply chains. But they are truths nonetheless, validated by every mission the Thunderbolt flew, every German fighter it destroyed, every pilot it brought home alive. In the end, the German pilots who laughed at the P-47 in 1943 were not wrong about its characteristics. They were wrong about what characteristics mattered. The Thunderbolt was heavy, clumsy, and built with American excess. These were not flaws to be overcome, but features to be exploited. The heavy weight became durability. The clumsiness at low altitude became devastating speed in a dive. The American excess became 8 machine guns that could destroy any aircraft they touched. The mockery died in the sky over Europe, killed by the same systematic efficiency that the Thunderbolt represented. The thunder of the R-2800 engine, the weight of 8.50 caliber guns, the sight of yet another Thunderbolt climbing back to altitude after a kill, these became the sounds and images of inevitable defeat. Not defeat in a single battle or campaign, but defeat in the larger contest of industrial civilizations at war. The P-47 Thunderbolt did not just shoot down German fighters. It demonstrated that American industrial democracy could outproduce, outlast, and ultimately overwhelm any enemy that challenged it. This demonstration delivered in aluminum and lead, and the bodies of German pilots proved more decisive than any diplomatic argument or ideological appeal. The Jug flew, the Jug killed, the Jug won, and in winning, it rewrote the rules of how wars would be fought forever after.